I have a lot of experience making very Hi everyone! In this video, we'll be exploring a few potential methods to make paint that is capable of sub-ambient radiant cooling. Basically, this paint could provide passive electricity-free air conditioning by sucking heat from its surroundings and hurling it into space as infrared radiation. As unbelievable as that sounds, there's a stack of published research documenting radiant paints that can reach temperatures as much as 10 degrees Celsius lower than the surrounding air temperature. There are a few different ways these paints have been made in the lab, and having gleaned what I can from half a dozen different papers, I think I've learned enough to make my own. We'll make 2 or 3 varieties in this video and test the cooling capability as compared to off-the-shelf white paint. The first thing to consider is how this paint is meant to work. Its first attribute is to have extremely high reflectance of light in the visible spectrum. A useful radiant paint should be able to maintain sub-ambient temperatures even in direct sunlight, and that becomes more difficult for every bit of sunlight that the paint fails to reflect, as the remainder is absorbed as heat. Reflectance alone isn't adequate to provide cooling, but it gives us a good starting point. The real magic of radiative cooling is in the particular wavelength of infrared light that the paint emits. All objects emit their energy as infrared light, but for the most part that light is scattered around in the atmosphere, absorbed by atmospheric gases, and re-emitted such that much of it returns back to Earth to be reabsorbed. It so happens that just a small sliver of the infrared spectrum passes clean through the atmosphere with little to no scattering. This is called the atmospheric infrared window. If we can engineer the composition of our paint to release its thermal energy as infrared light at just the right wavelength, it will blow right through the atmosphere and off into the coldness of space. By combining this emission of light with a strong rejection of incoming light in other spectrums, the overall effect is that the paint experiences a net loss of energy. It gets cold. The pigment in ordinary white paint that you can buy at a hardware store is usually titanium or zinc oxide. These have great reflectance, but they lack overlap in their emission spectrum with the atmospheric window. So far, the best results in making subambient cooling paint have come from using one of two pigments, calcium carbonate or barium sulfate. Both of these are bright white with good reflectance, and most importantly, the infrared emission is right where we want it. Here in this container is a little bit of diluted sulfuric acid, and in this other one is barium nitrate dissolved in water. Mixing these two will form our pigment, barium sulfate, which is so insoluble it should immediately fall out of solution. It's actually a very pretty reaction. Now, soluble barium compounds, like the barium nitrate that I started with in this container, are actually fairly toxic, so I made sure there was more than enough sulfuric acid to react with all of it, and that takes care of the toxicity. The reaction is what's called a double displacement, where the sulfuric part of the acid switches places with the nitrate part of the barium nitrate. In the end, we get a mix of barium sulfate, the insoluble pigment that we're looking for, and nitric acid in this beaker. I want to get rid of the acidity, so I'll add some concentrated ammonia, and this converts the nitric acid to ammonium nitrate. Now the waste from this experiment will be a nice fertilizer for my trees, instead of a dangerous acidic mess. The barium sulfate formed by this reaction is really hard to collect with filtering, because the particles are so fine they pass right through. It's better to let them settle out and then pour the water off the top. The last little bit of water can be removed by pouring the remainder onto a sheet of printer paper with paper towel underneath to gently suck the water through with capillary action. The paper contaminates the product slightly, but the result is good enough for our purposes. And here is our result, barium sulfate powder that we can mix with an acrylic base to form our paint. Well, right away I've noticed a problem. This is a sample of 60% transparent acrylic base to 40% barium sulfate pigment measured by weight. Let's brush this onto an object. Do you see the problem? There's a lot of transparency in this paint. For some reason, the barium sulfate becomes very transparent when mixed with a liquid. I can see now why this is not used as a standard white pigment. In any case, I'll try applying multiple coats and see how close to pure white we can get. Here's a little setup I've put together to test the light rejection of our paint samples. I have a light meter that is sealed to an outlet port on this circular chamber, and there's a focused beam of light coming in through another port and exiting through a slot in the side. Once I close off this open face, anything I put in front of the slot will reflect light back into the chamber and give us a brightness reading that is dependent on the total reflectance of the sample. I have a slide here that's been painted with off-the-shelf white paint, and using the reflectance of the light from this flashlight, we'll compare the reading with my homemade pigment. So there is our reading with standard ultra-white paint, and switching in the barium sulfate sample, we get a lower reading, which is bad news. This means the light rejection is not as good for the homemade sample, and therefore even with the infrared emission, it likely will not be able to cool objects in direct sunlight. Well, after a few more experiments and failures to improve my results, I found an excellent paper describing a process to make barium sulfate microspheres. The goal of the paper seemed to be creating highly reflective coatings for pharmaceutical products, which I guess matters for some reason. In any case, this sounded promising for my purposes. The previously used acid method of making barium sulfate is an extremely fast chemical reaction. Because the reaction happens so rapidly, the end product takes the form of amorphous blobs and random crystal structures. To form a particular particle shape, like microspheres, the reaction needs to take place in an orderly fashion, with controlled nucleation points. The way this is accomplished is by using another chemical in the solution that temporarily bonds with the dissolved barium ions, so there's some hesitation before they react. The delay is imperceptible to the eye, but it's enough to allow the crystals to nucleate from a billion little points and then continue growing outward at a steady rate in all directions, forming spheres. The chemical used to inhibit the reaction is called EDTA, which I mix into my soluble barium solution. No measurements were given in the paper I was referencing for this process, so I guess a molar equivalent with the barium should be about right. I tried half a dozen times to make this reaction work with barium nitrate as my starting chemical, because I have a lot of it and it's fairly inexpensive. This, however, seemed to cause a weird side reaction with the EDTA, forming a sticky substance which was completely inseparable from my barium sulfate end product. You can see it caused a brown tint to the light that passes through a solution of the resulting microspheres, and I could not get rid of it, no matter how many times I washed the particles with water and every other solvent I could think to try. I even bought a centrifuge to separate and wash the particles more easily, because unlike the acid-formed barium sulfate, the microspheres never seemed to settle to the bottom. When separated via centrifuge, the result was a gelatinous and still transparent pile of muck at the bottom of the tube, retaining the brown tint of the nitrate side reaction. My problems were eventually solved by exchanging the barium nitrate for barium chloride, which left the EDTA in a soluble state. Instead of sulfuric acid, this reaction uses sodium sulfate as the contributor of the sulfate ion. When the sulfate and chloride swap places, we end up with sodium chloride, ordinary table salt in solution, and barium sulfate, hopefully in the form of microspheres. Constant stirring and slow combination of the two liquids is needed to form microspheres of a consistent size. But in the case of paint, the best reflectivity comes from a variety of particle sizes. Fortunately, that's easy to accomplish. No stirring and a quick addition. Without the nitrate to form a weird gel, the spheres do eventually settle to the bottom of this container by gravity alone, but much more slowly than the acid-made pigment. My earlier centrifuge purchase still ended up being helpful for this purpose, as I can reduce the settling time from a few hours to just a few minutes at 4,000 RPM. Repeating this a few times, each time pouring off the liquid and adding fresh distilled water, leaves fairly pure barium sulfate, hopefully now in a state that is much more reflective and less transparent than the earlier amorphous particles. So here I have a sample slide of my microsphere paint, and this is my earlier made amorphous barium sulfate paint. And I have to say, visibly, the difference is not as dramatic as I had hoped, although there is a difference. This is brighter white. I've let these dry so that we can now take a look under the light meter. So the microsphere paint does read a little bit better, but it still has some obvious transparency. Since multiple papers report using barium sulfate in these paints, there must be some unmentioned secret sauce that's being used to reduce the transparency. My initial thoughts are that perhaps the barium pigment is being mixed with a standard titanium or zinc-based paint, or perhaps the barium paint is only used as a top coat over a layer of opaque white paint beneath it. Both of these options seem less than ideal. I think achieving the best result will require a new approach entirely. One method to make ultra-white coatings without the use of pigments is to replicate the same mechanism which is responsible for the highly reflective properties of snow. Snow is remarkable because, while it's made of transparent ice, it somehow manages to reject and reflect over 98% of incoming sunlight, making it even more reflective than almost all white paint. It does this with an enormous amount of small air pockets, which cause any light that passes through to stand a pretty good chance of hitting mirror-like surfaces of the ice crystals. Any light that makes it through one air gap soon hits another and another and another, until almost all of it ends up being reflected back where it came from. This effect can be roughly imitated with any transparent solid. For example, table salt, which on a close-up view is made up of transparent crystals. But get a whole pile of them together with air gaps in between, and the pile appears white. To make use of this snow scattering effect in a way that's practical for a painted surface, we're looking to achieve the maximum amount of air gaps in the thinnest layer possible. One method I found described in yet another article uses a clever series of physical reactions, first dissolving an exotic plastic in acetone, then adding a small amount of water. When this dissolved plastic mixture dries, the acetone evaporates first, leaving behind a layer of plastic which is completely permeated with microscopic water droplets. When the water dries, we're left with millions of tiny, regularly spaced cavities in the plastic. While the paper describing this process used an exotic and expensive plastic, I was able to replicate their results with ordinary transparent acrylic, which dissolves in acetone after a few days. Now, you can't just add water directly to this solution of dissolved acrylic because the water causes the plastic to crash out of solution instantly, forming little plastic jellyfish blobs with the water sealed inside. I found the best way to introduce water is to first mix it in a 1:4 ratio with acetone. So 0.1 ml of water is added for every 0.5 ml of this solution. So let's give this a try. If I've added enough water, the dissolved acrylic should go on clear and then turn white as it dries. Pretty neat stuff, isn't it? We can make really highly reflective surfaces this way with minimal effort and low cost. However, in terms of the infrared emission spectrum, it's not suitable for cooling. For subambient temperatures, we still need the barium sulfate or some other pigment that hits the infrared window. My idea at this point is to combine the brightest of my barium pigments, my sulfate microspheres, with the acrylic acetone mix. If all goes well, the snow scattering effect of the acrylic will aid in light rejection and opacity where the barium sulfate falls short, and the barium sulfate will contribute favorable emission. First of all, here is a test of various water ratios in the acrylic base. I dissolved 10 grams of acrylic in 100 ml of acetone, so I know there's 1 gram of plastic for every 10 ml of this solution. This allows me a controlled way to add incremental amounts of water and find out just how much should be added per gram of plastic for the best result. Between 0.5 and 0.6 ml of water per gram of plastic gave me good reflectance in this test with minor loss of adhesion and contraction. Later, when I opened a brand new can of acetone, I found that I had to double the amount of water added to achieve the same result, so apparently my old can absorbed quite a lot of water from the air with age. Once I determined the best results without pigment, I did a few tests with added barium sulfate, 2 grams of sulfate for 1 gram dissolved acrylic. So here is a test slide with the best result of my combinations, and to my eyes, this looks significantly brighter than off-the-shelf paint. If the reflectance test agrees, and if there's enough pigment for good infrared emission, I think there's a good chance that this will work. So let's give this a try. That is looking significantly better than my earlier attempts. The snow scattering effect seems to be really effective. Here's off-the-shelf paint and my paint. This might be a big enough difference to offer some cooling in sunlight. So here is my first full-size test sample, with ordinary white paint as the background of the square and an X in the center, which is my snow scattering paint. The X was painted right onto the wooden subsurface, with the off-the-shelf paint painted around it so that it would not be a double layer, which might make an unfair test. Now, I've made an awkward infrared camera rig with dual split lens filters on my camera so that I can get both close focus on the infrared camera and distant focus simultaneously. Hopefully, I'll also not overexpose the bright daylight landscape. Using this, let's take a look at my test sample after leaving it out in the sun for a few minutes. And here we do have a successful result. Clearly my paint is substantially cooler than the surrounding ordinary paint. But is it subambient? Not quite. The air temperature was about 65 degrees at this time, so we're close. But direct sunlight is the most difficult scenario for radiant paint. The best recorded results are only a few degrees cooler than ambient temperatures in direct sunlight, so to even get close with my DIY methods is satisfying. I think it's safe to say this is better cooling than you can probably get with any other paint currently available for purchase. Even so, sub-ambient temperatures are important for this to be useful. Fortunately, noonday sun is only around for a small sliver of the day. Let's try some tests with indirect sunlight and see if we can hit subambient numbers. This next test brought some unexpected results. My paint is currently a few degrees colder than air temperature here in the shade, subambient, but so is the commercial paint. My paint might be slightly colder, but not substantially. In direct sunlight, it's obvious that my paint is significantly better than ordinary ultrawhite, but I didn't expect the off-the-shelf paint to be so close in performance once direct light was gone. Despite not matching with the infrared window, it seems normal titanium-based paints can work pretty well for subambient nighttime cooling. Still, barium should be able to do much better, so all I can think is that I've not added enough pigment. I thought 2 grams of pigment for each gram of dissolved acrylic was pretty generous, but apparently more is needed. Here I have a 4-to-1 mix, and in this jar, 6 grams of pigment to each gram of dissolved acrylic. You would think that adding so much would get in the way of the snow scattering effect, but both of these mixes seem to work just fine, and actually read a fair bit more reflective than my original 2-to-1 mix. In outdoor testing, the 4-to-1 mixture proved to be significantly better at daylight cooling than the 2-to-1 mix, and the 6-to-1 was even better still, but just by a few fractions of a degree. This could maybe use a little bit of fine-tuning to dial in on the perfect mixture, but the 4-to-1 paint variation is what I used to make this sign, the result of which I think speaks for itself. The lettering is my homemade paint, surrounded by off-the-shelf ultrawhite, which clocks in at a full 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer after a few minutes in the sun. That is an incredible difference in temperature for 2 paints of the same color. My paint is still reading slightly above air temperature, but just barely. I think it would be subambient if it were not fighting the heat conduction from the surrounding paint. Strangely, even with this great daytime result, I found that once the sun went down, both the commercial paint and my own were still neck and neck for subambient temperatures. Both paints in this shot were reading below 65 degrees, while the air temperature was 85. This is a great result for both paints. I have to say, I did not expect ordinary white paint to perform so well. It's terrible during daylight hours, but it does have cooling potential at night. Now, since I tested so many different paints, I got tired of making my own barium sulfate and ended up just buying some. Theoretically, microspheres should do even better than this store-bought amorphous powder, but since the snow-scattering acrylic mix is the primary reflecting agent of this paint, added reflection from the pigment is just a bonus. Obviously, the paint works even with this amorphous pigment, which is great news for ease of manufacturing. Now at this point, having so far only matched air temperature in direct sunlight, I reread some of the articles about how sub-ambient temperatures have been reached by others, and realized most daylight cooling requires putting a film over the top of the paint to insulate it from the heat conduction of the wind. A thin polyethylene film apparently works well and allows infrared light to pass through it. I used this little tray to hold 2 samples of paint, my paint, and off-the-shelf paint, with a thin film stretched over the top to insulate the samples. With this, finally, we get some daylight cooling. My first test in this tray gave us about 2 degrees Fahrenheit below ambient. This was in direct noonday sunlight, so even though it's only a few degrees of cooling, it's cooling that could be counted on even in very unfavorable conditions. Added to 20+ degrees of cooling below air temperature at night, it's not hard to think of ways that this could be used to keep something cold all day long. For example, by cooling a building to 20 degrees below air temperature at night, so it lasts through the next day like a giant thermal battery. By the time it approaches air temperature, the sun is setting again and a new cooling cycle begins. Now, the way that I have these samples set up in this tray is actually a close approximation to how radiative cooling is most likely to find practical use. Not by directly painting buildings, because they would become too cold in winter, but rather to make cooling panels that cycle water or air through them only when cooling is needed. Some companies have already developed cooling panels and even installed them in limited test cases, but as far as I've found, no one has yet made them available for normal purchase. I would very much like to make and test my own panels that could potentially be recreated by anyone at home. This paint is a really good start, but I could easily double this video length just by discussing ideas to improve it. No promises, but I think we're looking at a series. This video's sponsor is Brilliant. I am really selective about the companies that sponsor these videos, but I keep going back to Brilliant because I so appreciate the way that they approach education. Brilliant specializes in teaching STEM topics through interactive and visually intuitive courses, which really makes the information stick in your mind. You can learn anything from basic math and logic to special relativity, with everything in between. When I work on projects like this one, I use a lot of measurements in percentages and parts, which is very important for being able to replicate the results consistently. If you have trouble making sense of those things, activate a free trial of Brilliant and check out their new course on everyday math. It starts with very simple visual problems that you can go through at your own pace. Their courses on logic and probability are some of my favorites as well. There's tons of other courses for anyone who would like to learn something new. To get started for free, go to brilliant.org/Nighthawk or click the link in the video description below, and the first 200 will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Now, I realize it has been a long time since my previous video. I've had some minor but annoyingly long-lasting health issues that slowed me down this last year. Thanks for sticking with me, especially those of you who support these videos on Patreon. I'll probably be slow in posting new videos for a few months still, but I am working on projects in the background. There's lots I'm excited to show you. I'm excited to keep improving on this Radiant paint, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Hi everyone! In this video, I'll be presenting a brand new method to make sky cooling paint using common grocery and hardware store items. This paint is inexpensive, the ingredients are readily available, and most importantly, it stays several degrees below ambient air temperature, even in direct sunlight. What that means is that we can use this paint to make cooling panels, which provide electricity-free air conditioning. In the future, I'll be attempting to build panels to air condition a small tool shed as a scaled-down test, working toward Hi everyone! In this video, I'll be presenting a brand new method to make sky cooling paint using common grocery and hardware store items. This paint is inexpensive, the ingredients are readily available, and most importantly, it stays several degrees below ambient air temperature, even in direct sunlight. What that means is that we can use this paint to make cooling panels, which provide electricity-free air conditioning. In the future, I'll be attempting to build panels to air condition a small tool shed as a scaled-down test, working toward a large-scale practical design that anyone can make at home. That's for another video. The paint itself will give us more than enough to learn about here. The process involves beautifully controlled microscopic crystallization, do-it-yourself plastic recycling, and the intentional misuse of kitchen equipment. Toward the end, I'll go through a simple step-by-step recipe, but first a brief explanation of how this paint works, and then we'll dive into my development process and several discoveries I made along the way. This is my second video about radiative cooling paint, and I think my original explanation was less intuitive than it could have been. Paint of this kind has two essential features. First, it needs to be extremely white so that visible light bounces off of it and is not absorbed as heat. Therefore, it absorbs very little sunlight, which would otherwise warm it up. The other feature is that it must radiate a particular wavelength of infrared light that passes straight through the Earth's atmosphere without being absorbed. All materials emit their heat as infrared light, which is why an infrared camera works. And typically, take note because this part is important, an object will easily absorb the same spectrum of infrared light that it emits. If that spectrum is absorbed by the atmosphere, it means that the atmosphere will, in return, emit the same spectrum of light back toward the Earth, warming all objects that easily absorb that same wavelength. If our paint releases light that does not react with the atmosphere, it will fly directly off into the coldness of outer space. And because the atmosphere does not emit the same wavelength back at the paint, the energy gained versus energy lost does not balance out. The paint gets colder than the air around it. Note that this does not violate any laws of thermodynamics. It only works because outer space is very cold, and heat naturally flows from hot things into cold things. The one feature that makes a cooling paint seem like magic is that it ignores the atmosphere, which usually is bouncing our own heat back at us so that we don't realize how cold it is a few miles above our heads. This paint only works when it's facing the sky, hence its name, radiative sky cooling paint. Before going further, let's look at some of the results. This is a panel with a stripe of cooling paint in the middle. If I aim a thermal camera at a piece of plywood that has been in the shade, we can use this as our baseline reading of ambient temperature. And then if I take off this piece of insulating foam, we can see the cold stripe in the middle of my test panel where the paint has cooled it. Notice that this has a reading several degrees colder than an identical piece of plywood in the shade. Infrared temperature readings can suffer from calibration errors when measuring dissimilar materials, but because we are comparing the readings between two samples of an identical material, this is a very accurate way of measuring the difference in temperature between them. This is amazing to me, and you can push the temperature even colder by bringing the painted sample into the shade also, as long as it still has a clear view of the sky. Now, before anyone goes painting their whole house with this stuff, this is a relatively fragile coating, and it requires being covered by a plastic film to not waste its cooling potential on the outside air, as well as to stay clean. I think the best practical way to use this is not going to be as a typical exterior building paint. In the long term, we'll have to design various items and applications that are intentional about using a radiative coating effectively. I, of course, will be working on this myself, starting with the previously mentioned cooling panels. So now that you've seen the demonstration of how this paint works, buckle in, because inventing a recipe for a cutting-edge technology that's as easy to follow as something out of your average cookbook was not a straightforward process. So in my first video on this topic, we explored a version of this paint that used barium sulfate as the pigment. Barium sulfate emits infrared light that the atmosphere is transparent toward, and the best results that have been reported in scientific literature have used this as the pigment. But there are other options. Calcium carbonate is the most notable option because it is extremely common and cheap. You might know it as limestone, eggshells, the main ingredient in cured cement. I take a tablet of this occasionally to treat acid reflux. We couldn't hope for a more common and safe ingredient. So using calcium carbonate was my goal for this project. The challenges to make that happen, it turns out, were unexpectedly difficult, and I'll explain why in a moment. The YouTube channel Tech Ingredients recently made their own video about radiative cooling paint. They achieved an excellent result with the previously mentioned barium sulfate pigment, and their methods helped me to realize a few strategies that I had neglected to take advantage of in my own paint. In my last video, I knew that microspherical pigment was used for many cooling paints in various research papers, but I didn't properly understand why. I thought that spheres were maybe just a little bit better at reflecting light than other random shapes, and so I tried making barium sulfate microspheres for use in my paint, but they only made a tiny difference in my results. What Tech Ingredients helped me to realize is that the primary benefit of using spherical particles is not reflectiveness, but packing density. Here I have a jar full of ping pong balls, and you can see that there are large air gaps between them. When randomly poured into a container, the density of spheres tends to be about 65% of the container's overall volume, leaving 35% as empty space. 65% is actually pretty high for shapes that were randomly dropped into a container, which is an advantage of spheres. They tend to slip past each other and arrange into a dense configuration all on their own. Now, if we know what we're doing, we can make the density way higher. By combining small spheres with these larger ones, we can fill in the gaps. Now the space between ping pong balls is itself 65% full, bringing the total density in this container to about 87%. 13% is still empty space between the gaps in these now smaller spheres, but that 13% could again be filled with even smaller ones, then achieving about 95% total density. And you could keep going further. The only qualification to achieve this super high density is that each size of sphere must be significantly smaller than the one before it. If the spheres are too close in size, it can actually make the density worse, because the larger ones need to be spread apart in order to make room for the next size. Ideally, each step down in size should be small enough to easily flow through the gaps between larger objects without their having to move out of the way. A microscopic version of this is how you make a high-density pigment, which is what has been shown to give the best results in a cooling paint. It's easy enough to make microspheres in a variety of sizes from barium sulfate. That was dealt with in my first video, and to an even greater extent by Tech Ingredients. Calcium carbonate has some very different chemical properties. While there are many papers about making calcium carbonate microspheres, there are very few that talk about how to make them in a variety of different sizes. In the end, I found no published method that was suitable for easy at-home reproduction, so we're going to have to come up with something completely new. Each one of these pipettes represents an individual experiment in which I attempted to make calcium carbonate microspheres and control for their size. As you can see, this took me a while. To make calcium carbonate, the first step in all cases was to react sodium carbonate with calcium chloride. Sodium carbonate is sold as washing soda in just about every hardware and grocery store. But don't get it confused with baking soda. Baking soda, if necessary, can be converted into washing soda by heating it in an oven at 200 degrees Celsius for about an hour. But it's better to just buy pure washing soda to begin with. Calcium chloride, the other chemical in this reaction, is sold in 50-pound bags for several purposes, one of which is for melting snow and ice, and the other is as a painter's desiccant. Basically, this is a chemical dehumidifier. It pulls water out of the air. Pure calcium chloride flake is sold in many hardware stores for one of these two purposes, and it's very inexpensive. I've used this both to melt ice on my sidewalk and to quickly dry out my basement after flooding. The point is, both of these ingredients are common and cheap. Dissolving each of these chemicals in water and then combining them will form our pigment, calcium carbonate, with a byproduct of table salt, sodium chloride in solution. The result of this simple reaction will give us lots of random crystal shapes. If we're lucky, we might be able to find a few spherical objects in with a mess of other things, but very few. There are a few tricks we can use to increase our chances of forming spheres. Many papers suggest using very dilute solutions of the starting ingredients. Just a pinch of calcium chloride and sodium carbonate in whole beakers of water, and then combined with very fast stirring on a magnetic stir plate. This method does work about a quarter of the time. It's very unreliable, but at the right reaction temperature and stir speed, we can get spheres instead of random crystals. But one enormous problem is that because of the low concentrations of ingredients, you would need to mix gallons and gallons of water to make just a little spoonful of microspheres in the end. You also need to use high purity deionized or distilled water for these reactions, so it's pretty wasteful. If we want to make enough pigment for practical use, we need a method that can make microspheres in quantities like this. Big honkin' bags full that can make enough paint to cover a large surface. To make this many microspheres, the methods that use low concentrations of ingredients are out, which disqualifies about 99% of all the published research on this subject. One exception was this paper, which used fairly high concentrations of calcium chloride and sodium carbonate. And what really stood out was their use of sodium citrate, which for some reason helped in the formation of spheres. At first, I did not pay for access to read this paper, so just going off of what I could see in the abstract, I started playing with sodium citrate as an additive to this reaction. This was super interesting. Sodium citrate, it turns out, delays the formation of calcium carbonate. When you have a bunch of sodium citrate mixed in the same solution as the calcium chloride, when you then add the sodium carbonate, everything turns into a gel. It's really weird. Under a microscope, it looks like fabric. What's even stranger is over the course of the next few hours, you start to be able to see tiny spheres growing out of this fabric. It's like stars growing in a microscopic nebula. So this method worked. After about 12 hours, all of the gel was consumed as the spheres grew, and they all end up just about the same size. This was with approximately a molar ratio of all three ingredients. What I discovered is that by reducing the amount of sodium citrate, the crystallization reaction starts to go faster and faster. Its primary function seems to be as a delaying agent. At a certain point, around 20% of the original sodium citrate concentration, we stop forming spheres and start to get other crystal shapes. But the reaction is still delayed enough that we can place a drop on a microscope slide and observe the crystals forming in real time. So I definitely learned some interesting things as a consequence of this paper. I ended up purchasing access to the full text, but it didn't turn out to provide much additional help. The paper only made one size of sphere, and their discussion about the possibilities of why sodium citrate helps in the formation of spheres was not very conclusive. In any case, using sodium citrate allowed me to make microspheres with the most consistent results yet. This was a necessary step before I could move on to further experiments to hopefully learn how to control their size. Immediately upon my first successful results, I tried changing the reaction temperature to make smaller and larger spheres. That's how barium sulfate spheres are made into different sizes, but calcium is not so cooperative. The reaction only worked in a range between about 5 and 30 degrees Celsius, and the size of spheres was very inconsistent. The size definitely did not correlate with a change in temperature. Much of the time, no spheres were made at all, which was very confusing. I also attempted to change stirring speed, stirring duration, and the concentration of the reactants to see if any of those things would make a difference in particle size. Again, very inconsistent results. For most of these tests, I was using a molar equivalent of sodium citrate compared to the calcium chloride in the solution, which meant that the crystal growth was very slow. But this ratio had given me the most reliable results early on, so I stuck with it. This is one of my first tests comparing the size of spheres made to the amount of time the solution was stirred. You can see that right toward the end, at the 40-minute and 1-hour mark, that the size becomes slightly smaller, but it stays the same until then. My conclusion from this was that stirring time has some effect on size, but that it's not very effective. That was a bad conclusion. It took me way too many failed experiments before I came back and reconsidered that this early test should not have been ruled out. This mistake turned out for the best because I discovered more things in the meantime that helped refine the final process. One of the things I discovered is a way to make the starting solution self-purifying. One issue with crystallization reactions is that the starting solutions need to be super clean because any speck of dust or contaminant will nucleate the growth of crystals in shapes that are not the ones we're looking for. This is a particularly annoying problem when using calcium chloride because this stuff reacts with CO2 from the air to form calcium carbonate, the same stuff we're trying to make, but in a disorderly way that prevents the formation of spheres. When I dissolve this calcium chloride in water, you can see that the solution is not clear. This milky haze is made up of microscopic calcium carbonate crystals that have naturally formed as CO2 reacted with the chloride flakes while they were in storage. If I used this solution immediately to make microspheres, about half of the end product would instead be jagged, misshapen chunks. For a good result, you have to let this solution settle for about 12 hours before using it, and then very carefully pour the clean liquid off the top. All of this can be avoided by swapping sodium citrate for citric acid. Citric acid dissolves calcium carbonate, so we can see that if I take a little bit of citric acid dissolved in water and pour it into the calcium chloride solution, it turns crystal clear. Citric acid dissolves all of the contaminants that would prevent the formation of spheres, and it performs the same function as sodium citrate because it actually turns into sodium citrate as soon as it mixes with the other chemical in this reaction, the washing soda, sodium carbonate. We also get other benefits, like citric acid being a common item in grocery stores because it's used for canning. And because of its purifying effect, we no longer have to use high-purity distilled or deionized water. I tried tap water, water from an in-ground well, and even water from a dirty rain barrel, and it all worked just as well for making microspheres because of the self-cleaning effect of the citric acid. Now, eventually I made my way back to testing stirring time as a means of controlling particle size. The reason this did not work very well the first time is because I was using so much sodium citrate that it delayed the reaction to the point that the first crystals didn't even nucleate until at least the 40-minute mark. There's no reason to expect that stirring before that point would make much difference. One final paper I'll mention is this one. This is by far the best article I found that explored the factors that change the size of these microspheres. The authors used methods that I think add unnecessary complexity, but their conclusions were super helpful. First of all, they confirmed that temperature is not at all effective for size control, which was welcome confirmation of my own findings. Most importantly, and I'm embarrassed to have not realized this myself, this paper found that the most important factor that determines the size of the microspheres is the number of nucleation sites in the solution. I should have realized this really early on, as soon as I saw the spheres growing in the fabric-like gel under my microscope, and how that gel was consumed as the particles grew. Think about it, if you only have one sphere growing in this whole patch of gel, it's going to get enormous, because it has so much material surrounding it that it can use to grow. On the other hand, if spheres start to grow from a whole bunch of nucleation points in the midst of this gel, they're going to start stealing resources from one another, and by the time the crystal feedstock is depleted, they will still be quite small. It's a very simple concept, and as soon as I read this paper, I knew why my first stirring tests had not worked, and the solution to my problem. I need to be stirring the solution during the nucleation stage of the microspheres. The agitation should create more nucleation points, and the more I stir during this stage, the smaller the resulting spheres should be. The other thing I can do is use less citrate so that the reaction occurs faster and I don't have to wait an hour before the stirring starts to become effective. I did a fresh batch of tests now that I switched in the new ingredient, citric acid, and found an effective mixture to reliably make spheres. I'll explain the details of that mixture in a moment. Here are the results of my first stirring test. For the first time, I was able to control the size of my microspheres very reliably. And even better, we know why this method works. If I want even smaller particles, I know the key is to use even more agitation, generate even more nucleation sites during the initial stages, and we'll get yet smaller spheres, perhaps even down into the nanoscale. Well, that was a deeper dive than I expected to get into, but now you know some details about what we're actually doing here. Actually, I haven't even explained why I think spheres are formed instead of other shapes. There's a lot of technical information that maybe I'll talk about in a supplementary video. It's about time I present the final recipe for making this pigment. To make everything as easy as possible to follow, all the ingredients are dissolved in a 1:10 ratio with water. The basic mixture, which can be scaled up or down, is 20 grams of sodium carbonate dissolved in 200 milliliters of water, 10 grams of calcium chloride dissolved in 100 milliliters of water, and 3 grams of citric acid dissolved in 30 milliliters of water. The mixture of citric acid is combined with the calcium chloride solution, which causes it to go clear as the acid dissolves any impurities. Now, the liquids in these containers must be between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius before mixing them, ideally right in the middle at 15 degrees. A small kitchen thermometer is perfect for measuring this, and the chemicals we're using are not at all dangerous for food contact, so if necessary, you can cool the solutions in a refrigerator. Once the liquids are within the 10 to 20 degrees Celsius boundary, all we need to do is mix them together with vigorous stirring. I used a magnetic stir plate for all of my earlier experiments, but I think a better tool to use is a blender, particularly because this will be useful for a second purpose later in the paint making process. You can also get these super cheap at second-hand shops, often for less than $10. The calcium chloride and citric acid solution goes in first, and at this point we need to be ready with a timer. Side note, because this blender holds a lot of liquid, I have tripled the basic recipe size so that it fills more of the container and will not splash as much when I turn the blades on. Now we can set this blender at the lowest speed, and when ready, remove the lid and pour in the second solution of sodium carbonate. Right then, we start the timer. The largest sphere size will be made with about 1 minute of blending. Here again are the results from my tests with a stir plate. A blender is much more powerful, which means you can expect the particle size to shrink even more dramatically for each increment of stirring time. I'll stop the blender after 1 minute for our first batch of the largest particle size. For the time being, this mix can be poured into a separate container while we get ready for another batch. Cleaning between batches is really easy because our ingredients are dissolved by acid. Put the container back on the blender, pour in a splash of vinegar and some water to dilute it, and turn the blender on. Everything will be clean and ready to use again within a few seconds. Now, our largest microspheres are starting to settle out in this container. For a high-density pigment, we now need a smaller size to mix with them. If we go back to the percentage bar I used earlier when talking about sphere packing, we can see that the largest size takes up 65% of the total volume, and the next size takes up 65% of the remaining volume. If you ignore the empty space and just look at the ratio between these two parts, you can see that you only need about 25% small particles compared to the volume of the larger ones. In other words, you need 3 parts large particles for every 1 part of a smaller size. So to make a whole bunch of pigment, we can repeat what we just did 2 more times so that we triple the amount of these large microspheres. And then we run 1 more batch and make that one a smaller particle size by blending it longer, for about 5 minutes. When the 4 batches are combined, it will be 3 parts large spheres and 1 part small to match the percentages of the scale. For the best results, you can go 1 step further and increase the density to 95% with a third size. The quantity should again be reduced to 1/3 of the previous batch. This mix should be blended for 8 to 10 minutes, which brings you well into the range of making nanoparticles. These are very small. So now I have 5 total batches, and these 3 contain my largest particle size. This one is a medium size, and in this container are the very smallest microspheres. Most of them have already settled to the bottom of the first 3 containers, so now we just need to wait about 15 minutes for these ones to do the same thing. Once settled, the clear liquid can be poured off the top as waste. This contains lots of dissolved table salt, sodium citrate, and excess sodium carbonate, all of which is non-toxic, but we don't want it in our final product. The microspheres should then all be combined into 1 single container and topped off with fresh water. Over the course of a few minutes, everything will settle out again, so the top can once again be poured out as waste and refilled with more water. We'll do this 2 or 3 times to remove as much of the dissolved salts as we can, and then it's time to filter and collect our finished pigment. Filtering nanoparticles can be pretty difficult because they either pass through or clog most filter paper. Fortunately, I've found an easy solution. We will use capillary action to suck the water out of these particles through an ordinary piece of printer paper. First step is to take one of these disposable aluminum bread trays, cut an opening in the bottom, and line the tray with a paper towel. Now insert a piece of printer paper, carefully folding it to line the sides. You don't want any part of the edge to be too low in the tray or the liquid will overflow. And this is our filter. We can pour in the finished pigment and watch as the water drains out. Because of the paper towel that lines the bottom of the tray, water is pulled through much more quickly, and this only takes about 15 minutes to drain. The paper becomes very fragile when wet, so don't stick a spoon in here and stir the pigment around, or you could cause a tear when you touch the sides. Once fully drained, I recommend refilling this 1 more time with distilled water to pull out the last bit of dissolved contaminants. Finally, the whole tray can go right into a toaster oven set to stay on at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 Celsius for about 2 hours, with the door open to let out steam. And here is the finished pigment, dry and on the filter. This can be carefully crumbled and poured into a plastic bag for storage. I recommend wearing a dust mask for this step, or doing it outdoors. Pure calcium carbonate is not particularly dangerous because your body chemistry can actually dissolve it, but this powder is really dusty, and a mask is an easy precaution. That's all there is to it to make this high-density cooling pigment. It's about a 5 or 10 minute process to measure the ingredients for each batch, get them blended, and then clean out the blender for the next one. About a half hour in total to get all the batches made for each particle size, and then the settling, filtering, and drying process can be done in the background while you work on other things. It really doesn't take a lot of effort, and if you want to make more, just switch in some bigger equipment. You can make 4 or 5 kilograms at a time with a paddle mixer and a garbage can. By the way, you can expect to end up with about 8 grams of calcium carbonate microspheres for every 10 grams of calcium chloride used in the starting ingredients. That's about a 90% yield compared to the theoretical maximum, which is pretty good. So let's look at this under a microscope, and hopefully we'll be able to see how the particles come together in a high-density configuration. And that's exactly what we see. All the gaps between large objects are filled in with smaller ones. That means that when we're counting on this pigment to radiate its heat away as a particular wavelength of infrared light, every microscopic area of our paint will be jam-packed with particles that can do so. Very little wasted space between them. So this high-density pigment, which can now be easily made at home, is by far the most important ingredient in a sky cooling paint. It's possible that this could be mixed with all sorts of different off-the-shelf products to make coatings that can reach subambient temperatures. That will require further testing. As it stands right now, I only know of one mixture that definitely works, which uses the same method detailed in my previous video on this subject. That is, using a base of dissolved acrylic with a special effect that allows the finished coating to scatter light using the same properties as snow. To make the liquid base for our pigment, I start with a beaker of acetone. For every 110 milliliters of acetone, we will add 12 milliliters of water. Make sure this is fresh acetone, not more than a few years old. Otherwise, it will already have absorbed water from the air, which will throw the measurement off. With the water mixed in, I then add 10 grams of acrylic and seal the opening tightly with a piece of foil. Last step is to mark the beaker so you know exactly how full it is at the start, so if any acetone evaporates, you can refill it to this line. The acrylic pieces are literally shards of broken acrylic windows, plexiglass. You can get scraps of this for free if you call a few hardware stores that do glass cutting, because inevitably they end up with thin little strips left over from cutting acrylic windows. Usually these just get thrown away unless someone like me shows up and asks to have them. The acrylic will slowly dissolve in the acetone over a few days, but you can shorten this process to a few hours if you put it on a hot plate at a really low temperature, about 110 Fahrenheit, 43 Celsius. By using a water bath, it makes it much easier to hold the temperature steady. Now, if I had dissolved the acrylic in pure acetone, when it dries it would once again turn clear. However, because I added water to this mixture, the water is going to stay behind as tiny droplets in the plastic until after the acetone evaporates. The water will evaporate later, leaving behind millions of tiny hollow spaces in the acrylic that scatter light. This makes the formerly transparent layer of plastic transform into a very bright white, using the same effect that makes snow appear white, even though snow is made from transparent ice. This will give us a free increase in the brightness of our paint, and the effect works even better once we start adding pigment. This also increases the flexibility of the final coating, because it gives the paint a microscopic foam-like structure that is able to more easily deform without developing cracks. The application method that I currently use for this paint actually does not work if water is not added. Pure acrylic buckles and peels in giant pieces as it dries, but the mixture with water holds strong. When I make this paint from scratch, I usually prepare the acrylic mix first, so that it's ready to use by the time I'm finished making the pigment. If you do the math on this mixture, there's about 1 gram of acrylic dissolved in every 12 milliliters of liquid, to which we will need to add 7 grams of pigment. This mixture can of course be scaled up, so since I have 120 milliliters of the acrylic mix here, I will need 70 grams of the pigment. For 1.2 liters, you would need 700 grams, which would make about 2 liters of paint in total, because the volume increases when the pigment is added. One of the best things about using this microsphere pigment is that it mixes into a paint really easily. You don't have to use any power mixing to get this to distribute through the liquid. It can be stirred in by hand. Now, if you washed the pigment extremely well during the settling and filtering process, there should be no clumps that take more than light pressure to fully disintegrate. But chances are you may not do a perfect job filtering, which will result in hard clumps distributed throughout the powder. These are caused by water-soluble contaminants like table salt or leftover sodium carbonate that was still in the powder when it went into the oven to dry. When the water evaporates, these contaminants crystallize in between the microspheres, gluing some of them together. The good news is that these are really easy to deal with using the blender that made this pigment in the first place. The powder is put right into the blender dry so that the blades can break up any water-soluble crystals and the clumps will not be able to reform. You want to be careful doing this for the sake of the blender, because without liquid the blades can easily overheat and damage the seal that keeps this container watertight. Only blend for about a minute at a time on low speed, and then let the container cool off before turning it on again. After 4 or 5 cycles, the powder should be completely smooth and ready to use. The blender, by the way, won't cause any damage to the microspheres. Compared to their microscopic size, the blades in this are about as blunt as my forehead. Not nearly sharp enough to slice anything in half. So now the acrylic mix is ready, the pigment is lump-free, and we can mix these together. 7 grams of pigment for every 12 milliliters of liquid. This should only take about 30 seconds to a minute of stirring before the microspheres are evenly distributed and this starts to look like paint. The acetone in this is going to evaporate really quickly, so as soon as I'm done mixing, I'll cover this with my foil again until I'm ready to use it. While I mix this, we're going to take a pause here for this video's sponsor. Well, with this project requiring so many variations on experiments, I found myself wishing I had some basic programming skills to help analyze the data. My younger brother is actually a professional physicist, and he's told me a few times that I would benefit from learning the programming language Python. So I've finally started doing that, using a course on Brilliant.org. Brilliant is seriously the best for learning math, science, and computer science because their courses teach through interaction. You get to play with the problems on screen in a way that helps you to understand a subject from the inside out. It prevents a common problem that I've experienced in my own education, where I learn a new subject, but I don't really understand why one solution works and another fails. That seems like a really shallow education. I want to know why something works, not just that it does. This is where Brilliant really shines and why I've been happy to have them as a sponsor for over 5 years. This intuitive hands-on problem solving that they work into their courses is excellent at getting that deep understanding to sink in. It's fun too, and really satisfying to learn a new skill. Brilliant has thousands of lessons to choose from. You don't need to just be interested in programming or math. You can check out everything they have to offer for free for a full 30 days by using my link brilliant.org/Nighthawk. And if you like what you see, you can also get 20% off an annual premium subscription by using that same link. Isn't that right, Mose? He agrees. Now this is where I need to confess that calling this mixture a paint is playing pretty loose with the definition of the word. It doesn't spread well with a brush, and I've yet to perfect a way of applying this with a paint sprayer. The closest I've come to spraying this on is with a hand-squeezed chemical spray bottle, and then it comes out less like a spray and more like coarse drops, which self-level on the surface. This actually works reasonably well, and the liquid has enough viscosity to stick even to non-level surfaces. You can see that I was able to paint an aluminum tube with this method for an experiment that may or may not make it into a future video. Because of the water included in this coating that gives it a foam-like structure, it's able to be applied in extremely thick single layers, even up to several millimeters at a time. When it dries, it will shrink down to about half of its thickness. I think half a millimeter is probably close to the ideal thickness to aim for in the dry state. You won't hurt anything by applying a thicker coating, but then of course it's a waste of materials if you could have spread it over a larger area. The most reliable application method that I've found so far is to use a large syringe. First, suck up the paint. Shake the liquid down into the base of the syringe so you can purge any air bubbles from the tip, and then extrude it line by line on the surface. You do get little ridges and uneven thicknesses between lines, but those get better with practice. It seems like this would be a really silly way to apply a coating to a large surface, but the more I try it, the less impractical it feels. You can buy really big 300 milliliter syringes, which would hold plenty of paint for a very large cooling panel. It would be better if we could find a flat tip for these syringes so that you could cover a wider area with each pass. And on that note, I had a different idea, which was to use a piping bag. These of course are made for applying frosting to a cake, and you can get super wide nozzles for the end of the bag. The only problem is that you have to be much more particular about the consistency of your paint, because if it's too thin, it will pour out and make a huge mess. At the right consistency, this works really well to lay down wide sections at a time. So those are a few ideas that I have successfully used to apply this coating so far. I obviously hope to develop a more standardized and convenient application method in the future, but at least we have several options in the meantime that definitely work, even if they're a little bit strange. Developing the calcium microsphere recipe is an enormous step forward in terms of making sky cooling paint accessible for the average person. I think the pigment made in this video is as good as anything available, even to scientists in commercial laboratories. But that does not mean there's no more room for improvement. I've barely scratched the surface of what kinds of sealants, silicones, adhesives, polymers that this pigment could be mixed with and still achieve the same or even better cooling. There are endless experiments to try. And now that you all know how to make high-performance pigment, I hope to see a few more people testing their own ideas. If you do, take a video, email me a link, and I'll feature it on my channel homepage in the video response playlist. If this video seems like a valuable contribution to the things you enjoy, consider supporting my channel on Patreon. Most of my videos will not be this long or this in-depth, but the more people who back these projects with a fixed contribution, the less I need to worry about spending weeks at a time making fancy dust, and then giving away my fancy dust recipe for free. Fortunately, all of you have been really good to me by watching these videos over the years, keeping my views up so I can continue to get sponsors, coming back even when I've been gone for months due to sickness or failed projects. Thank you for that, and thank you for continuing to leave me comments. To this day, I still read all of them on all of my videos. It's not as hard as you might think. It takes me maybe 10 minutes per day. I really enjoy hearing from you. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Hi everyone! Today we will be learning about a simple experimental method that will dramatically improve improve your results and understanding of any experiment you happen to try. Maybe you want your garden plants to grow healthier or to improve a recipe for bread. You could even... Hi everyone! Today we will be learning about a simple experimental method that will dramatically improve your results and understanding of any experiment you happen to try. Maybe you want your garden plants to grow healthier or to improve a recipe for bread. You could even use this technique to optimize the format of YouTube videos to make them more entertaining. When I first tried this method, I thought my initial experiment was going to be a total failure, thinking I must have done something wrong because the information I got out of it was so surprising that I didn't trust it. It turns out that this new method had revealed something that I had never even considered in 10 years of tinkering on the same project. When I finally did trust the results, it led to the fastest improvements I've ever made. There's one thing that I learned very early on when I first became interested in various sciencey, inventive projects. When working on a complicated experiment, only change one variable at a time. That way, when you see the results, you know exactly the thing that changed and whether that one thing had a positive or negative effect. If you change two things at once, you would never know which change is responsible for your result. In fact, one of the two changes might be helpful to your experiment, while the other is so destructive that it makes the entire test look like a failure. You don't learn anything by doing this, and you actually concealed information that might have helped you. So, I have used the method of only changing one variable at a time for about the last 15 years. And you can see on my channel that it has served me well in creating lots of successful projects. Recently, however, I found myself working on a project head and shoulders more complicated than most of the things I've attempted in the past. That is, developing a new process for making calcium carbonate microspheres. By changing only one variable at a time, I realized through great effort and long suffering that optimizing a fairly simple chemical reaction can quickly add up to many hundreds of individual experiments. I was out to dinner with some friends and got to complaining about the difficulty I was having, to which they asked, "Are you only changing one variable at a time?" Yeah, I said, how else would I know which of my changes worked? It turns out that these friends of mine used to have jobs working on the optimization of factory processes and were familiar with experimental methods that I had never heard discussed in the realm of hobby projects, or even among other amateur chemists like myself. That needs to change. This experimental process is not complicated, and the results are awesome. So to explain how this works, I thought we might actually try a real experimental task. We'll start with something simple. Let's find out if the common advice for making boiled eggs peel easier really works. Now, we could find many different tips for this if we looked online, but I decided to try just 3 different things. 2 are related to temperature, whether it matters how cold the egg is when it goes into the boiling water, and also if it matters whether we drop the cooked egg in ice water while it's still hot. The last variable is an additive, vinegar, which supposedly helps loosen the shell if a small amount is added to the water. So we have 3 different variables and a variety of ways that we could test them. We could run 4 different tests, starting with a control, where the eggs are room temperature going into the water with no vinegar added, and then are also allowed to cool at room temperature as well. This would give us a baseline to compare 3 more tests where we try each of our changes. If any of these makes the eggs easier to peel than the control test, then we know what does and does not work. But here's where it gets complicated. What if adding vinegar to the boiling water does not make the eggs easier to peel by itself? But perhaps if the egg is first treated with vinegar and then also dropped into cold water, the combination of these 2 variables has an effect where individually they fail. We would not discover that with our series of 4 tests, so we need to add 4 more to account for all possible combinations. It's not entirely unreasonable to do 8 different tests, but that number quickly spirals out of control if you add a 4th variable, or a 3rd setting to each of the existing variables. This is called a full factorial analysis because it explores all possible combinations of an experiment, giving you the most data possible in exchange for an enormous amount of work. In certain types of experiments, this may be worthwhile, but for investigating the peeling characteristics of boiled eggs, no thank you. Fortunately, we can get most of the relevant data from a much smaller set of experiments, one that looks like this. You can see that we still have a control group, which the other tests can be compared to. But after the first run, every other test has two different changes occurring at once. There are similar tables that can be used for experiments with many more variables, but we'll get to that later. With this arrangement, we only need to do 4 tests. So let's get started. I'll do each run with 4 eggs each, so that we have a decent sample size to know what works. Experiment 1 will start with eggs at room temp, and experiment 2 will start in ice water. These are then placed into the boiling water for 11 minutes, and then the eggs marked with a 1 are left to cool at room temp, while the others go back into the ice. For the second pair of tests, I'll add a 1/4 cup of vinegar to the water, and according to our experiment table, the third test is meant to start at room temp, while the fourth starts in the ice. Another 11 minutes in the boiling water, and then number 3 goes into the ice, while number 4 cools in open air. And now we record our results. This is the most difficult part of running an experiment like this. How exactly do you record the difficulty of peeling a boiled egg as an objective number? You might say that this egg was extremely easy to peel, so we'll record it as a 10, and another was difficult to peel, so maybe it's a 5? But that's just an arbitrary estimation. It's hard to be objective about assigning accurate numbers to such an organic and messy process. So it's very important to identify something about the results that can be measured with scientific precision. In this case, I decided to assign 3 different levels of success in the ease of peeling an egg. If the shell slips off cleanly and easily, that scores a 3. If some pieces of the egg are left stuck to the shell, that scores a 2. And if large pieces tear off the egg, more than a ½ inch square, that scores a 1. I might also give a partial score of 1.5 or 2.5 if pieces break off in one place, but most of the egg peels cleanly. In this way, we can assign a mostly objective number value to an otherwise messy process, which is essential for accurately interpreting the results. Now, I encountered a problem here, because every egg except one peeled perfectly, which reveals that other factors besides those that we are testing have an effect on our results. Age of the eggs is one factor that is known to have an effect. So I had to repeat this test with fresher eggs that are normally much more difficult to peel. Now we should have some usable data. So here is the score of all 16 eggs from all 4 of my tests. Totaling these together, we end up with a single value for the result of each run. So how does this solve the original problem of testing 2 variables at once? If we take any one of these tests and compare it to the baseline, we do see a difference between the two. But as expected, it's impossible to tell which change is responsible for the increased value. However, the other 2 results are more revealing. Let's look at the egg's starting temperature first. If we take the 2 tests where the eggs started at room temp and add their scores together, we get a total of 19.5. Now taking the other 2 tests where the eggs started in ice water and totaling their scores, we also get a total of 19.5. When we look at the combined values of tests where the eggs started at room temp and those which started in ice, there was exactly 0 difference between the results. So what does that tell us? The temperature of our eggs as they go into the boiling water made no significant difference in how easily they peeled. Likewise, we can add together the values of tests with and without cooling the eggs in ice water after cooking and see a difference of 1. And with and without vinegar in the water for a difference of 4. That is significant. It seems that the vinegar in the water really does help the eggs peel easier. As for dropping in ice water, it might help, but only barely, and in fact it's very possible that this value of 1 is just due to a single egg being slightly easier to peel than average. To be more accurate, we could use 10 or 20 eggs for each test. But these results are good enough to say with confidence that vinegar makes a difference, and the other 2 things are at most comparatively insignificant. Already we have learned all of the information that we would have by testing each variable individually, And in fact, we've done so to a greater degree of confidence because each change was tested twice. But that's not all. If you look closely, every variable was tested against every other variable. So we know that the combination of a cold egg going into the boiling water and then being plunged back into ice water has no compounding effect, because there's little difference when compared to the baseline. Likewise, vinegar does not seem to have a compounding effect with either of the other variables, because if that were the case, we would expect one of these values to be significantly different from the other. In fact, we learned almost everything from just these 4 tests that one could hope to learn from a full array of all possible configurations. So how does this particular set of experiments manage to give us so much information without some of it getting buried by the double variable changes? The table we used is called an orthogonal array, sometimes called by the name of its inventor, a Taguchi array. The rules for assembling this type of experimental arrangement are fairly simple. Every level of each variable should be tested an equal number of times. So if we test the addition of vinegar twice, we also need to do 2 tests at a baseline level of vinegar, which in this case was none. A second rule is that every level of each variable should be tested against every level of the others, also an equal number of times. Both of these rules combined means that if we look at any variable on our table, say the vinegar, even though multiple things are being tested at once, look, for both tests that the vinegar is high, the changes in the other columns are opposite to one another, meaning if you add the results of these 2 tests together, the effect of the other variables cancels out. The same is true in these 2 rows, where the level of vinegar is constant, the other changes cancel each other when the results are added together. It's as if we tested vinegar all by itself. This works for the other variables also, where the middle column has a low value, the 2 rows added together cause the other changes to cancel out. How awesome is that we can do 4 tests and get results from each variable individually, and results for what happens when you add the variables together. Maybe you're not impressed yet, because this was a very small test. Here is what an array looks like with 4 different variables, each with 3 different settings, high, neutral, and low. A complete series of tests for this many factors would require 81 individual experiments. This table gets the job done in 9. Before looking at more advanced applications of an orthogonal array, I thought we might take a brief pause here to talk about improving our understanding of logic in general, made super easy with the help of my sponsor, Brilliant.org. My favorite courses on Brilliant are about logic and scientific thinking, because the skills you learn through those courses are immediately useful in almost any situation. Being better equipped to detect what is true and false, what is sound reasoning, and what rests on fallacy, those are skills that can improve not only our understanding of scientific topics, but also refine our opinions in everyday life. The courses on Brilliant make logic and scientific reasoning very easy to learn. One of my favorite philosophical, psychological topics is the idea of being wrong, and specifically how it feels to be wrong about something. That is, being wrong feels exactly the same as being right. We can be very confident in a false idea, right until the moment that a logical error is exposed and we realize our confidence was founded on a misconception. How can I know that the things that I am confident about are true when others are just as confident that I am wrong? You'll see in the second half of this video that I was confidently wrong about an aspect of one of my experiments. The solution was to take a step back, accept the possibility that my preconceptions might be wrong, and see what conclusions logically followed from new information. One of my goals in life is to become increasingly aware of which of my opinions I can be confident about, and which ones require more humility and greater readiness to accept correction. Logic and scientific thinking are some of the key tools that I find useful in distinguishing between the two, which is why I appreciate those courses on Brilliant. Their other courses are also very useful on thousands of targeted topics, like math, data science, and computer science, which they teach very skillfully with interactive problems and challenges. You'll have fun with Brilliant's courses and find that they can help you learn no matter what skill level you're starting from. You can get started with Brilliant for free for 30 days using my link, brilliant.org/Nighthawk. And the first 200 to use that link will also get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. My first attempt at using an orthogonal array used this 4-variable table. I was trying to refine a new formula for a type of Japanese sparkler called a Senko Hanabi. These are a notoriously difficult firework to perfect, and to reach my current level of competence in making them actually required visiting a master craftsman in Japan. Every time one of the ingredients in these sparklers is adjusted, every other component needs to be adjusted in response. I've found this effort to be well worth my time over the years because they're just unbelievably beautiful in person, and their function is scientifically very unique and fascinating. One of the key ingredients is called lamp black, which is basically a fancy version of soot from a flame. In Japan, they made this soot from decades-old pine tree stumps, meticulously prepared and burned over the course of several days in a room enclosed by walls of tissue paper. When finished, the lamp black is scraped off the walls and sold as high-end calligraphy ink, and for use in Senko Hanabi sparklers. That is a process which is not at all accessible to the average person, and so I've sought ways to make lamp black through easier processes that will still work in these sparklers. One way to do that is by burning vegetable oil under a metal tray. The soot collects on the metal surface, and afterward, the lamp black can be brushed off the tray, which I find enormously satisfying. Now, changing the fuel source in the creation of soot dramatically changes its properties, and so this oil-derived lamp black no longer works in the same formulas I've used before, hence the need for a new experiment. Another fellow here on YouTube who goes by the username Zoltree is the one who made me aware of this method for producing lamp black, and he was kind enough to also share a semi-functioning recipe that works adequately well in these sparklers. That's what we'll start with as our baseline, and see if it can be further improved through an orthogonal array of tests. There are 4 ingredients in these fireworks, 1 that provides oxygen to the mixture, and 3 which are fuels. Since I don't know if we need more or less of each of the ingredients, we need to test 3 settings for each. 1 that lowers the ingredient, 1 that keeps it the same, and 1 that raises it. The amount that each of these ingredients is adjusted by for each setting is mostly arbitrary. I chose small enough changes that I suspected they would still allow the sparklers to function for all of the tests, but still be a big enough change to notice if that change has an effect. So, I mixed up 9 different sparkler compositions based on the measurements determined by the 4-variable orthogonal array. This table was just pulled out of a list of tables set up for experiments of various sizes. You don't need to build these tables yourself. Just Google Taguchi arrays and you will likely find one that will work for as many variables as you'd like to test. With my 9 different compositions, I then rolled 2 sparklers with each, which is a pretty small sample size. Ideally, I should have made more and added the results between 4 or 5 sparklers like we did for the egg experiment. But 2 for each test did end up giving me plenty of usable information. The next step is once again the most difficult, figuring out a way to measure the results so that we can assign them an objective score. I decided the best way to do this was to place the sparklers in a fixed position over a grid, so that with a camera we could later measure the various effects. These sparklers have 3 distinct sparking stages. The first shoots out large bursting sparks, the second produces a ball of small crackling sparks, and finally there's a stage of miniature, non-branching sparks that shoot out of an ember that slowly climbs the paper stem. To give these sparklers a score, I'll record the distance traveled of the top 3 bursting sparks that shoot from the sparkler. Then I'll measure the average diameter of the crackling spark stage, and finally I'll give the last stage a score of 1, 2, or 3 based on 3 different ways in which that stage can progress. One by one, these sparklers were ignited over the test grid, and to be honest, I really started to think that this was not going to work. The sparklers seemed to behave so randomly, and mixtures which I thought would perform really well ended up looking terrible. In my head, I started rewriting the script for this video, explaining the shortfalls of experimental methods and maybe where I went wrong. Even once I got the footage back onto my computer and started adding up the results, I was slipping into some hopelessness of learning anything worthwhile from all this work. This is the finished table with the results added up. First of all, notice how much harder it is to understand these results just by looking at them compared to the egg test. It didn't take much brain power to notice that vinegar made a big difference when there were only 4 numbers to compare. For this, we actually need to process the data. To do that, remember that we add together the scores of each test with the same variable change. So we'll start with the oxidizer, potassium nitrate, and add together the scores when it's at the low setting. This gives us a total of 125. The tests with the nitrate at the high setting add up to 123.5. Filling out the results for the rest of the variables looks like this. These results so go against my expectations that I still thought they must be wrong. My experience with these sparklers so far has taught me, incorrectly it turns out, that the more lamp black you can shove into the recipe, the better a result you will get. The ingredient that I typically lower to make room for more lamp black without disturbing the ratio of oxidizer to fuel is the charcoal. By increasing lamp black, it would slow the sparkler's burn, and so I would balance it by reducing the charcoal and achieve a better result. And therefore, I believed that increased lamp black generally made for better sparks. In fact, what these results are telling me is that the extra lamp black often has a negative effect, which is hidden by the overwhelming benefits of reducing the charcoal. I never discovered this with a one variable at a time approach, because while I did adjust the ingredients only one at a time, I would always add lamp black first, test the burn, and then lower the charcoal to compensate. If I had thought to lower the charcoal first, I might have noticed that that was the real cause of my improved results, where adding the lamp black was actually making them worse. I know that I'm rambling on about a very niche project, but hopefully this serves to illustrate how powerful this experimental method is. My first time using it revealed information that I had completely backwards about a project I've spent more than a decade working on. It's amazing. When I was finally convinced that these numbers might be accurate, I made a few more mixtures, stepping down the amount of charcoal in each batch. The results of these tests were literally off the scale that I had set up. One thing that this orthogonal array does not tell us is how far we can push the reduction in charcoal before things fall apart. I found that a significant reduction did offer improvements, but there's still a balance of burn rate that needs to be maintained. Also, I found that when I reduced the charcoal too much, I start losing the last stage of sparks. This is where going back to the test data can help in other ways. Since I recorded the score for different sparking stages individually, I can look at the scores for the last stage, which is now giving me trouble. What I notice is that in 3 out of 4 tests, where the last sparking stage had a perfect score, the sulfur level was high. When the sulfur was low, the results were poor. So, if I want to improve this final sparking stage, the key according to the numbers is to increase the sulfur. This multivariable experimental method very rapidly gave me this information to drastically improve my sparklers. Really, that's what this method is very good at, pointing you in the correct direction for improvement. Now that I have decreased my charcoal and increased my sulfur, the results are much better. But from here, I could do another panel of experiments and it would probably reveal more subtle changes that could be adjusted from this new and improved baseline. After dramatically lowering the charcoal, maybe now it would be beneficial to add back some lamp black, but probably less than I would have before. I have no idea what a new series of tests would show me. You can run these panels over and over again with diminishing returns to come ever closer to perfection. Now here is the challenge. I've just shown how to use a Taguchi array for 2 experiments that were quite different from one another, and I did this intentionally. I want to demonstrate how you can take completely different tasks, like boiling eggs and making sparklers, and set up an experiment in a way that results in useful information. Figuring out how to do the same with whatever project you might be working on will require its own set of measurements. In a way, this video has been about experimental methods in general. Most of the challenge is figuring out how to quantify organic lived experiences into numbers that can be more easily interpreted. That's the real magic of living in a universe that miraculously makes mathematical sense. Well, I know there will be many of you wondering how I could be so surprised by experimental methods that have been common knowledge forever in your industry. I've found that I know very little of all the information that's out there. Hopefully this will be helpful to a few of you. Thank you to all of you who support me on Patreon. I very much appreciate that you find value in what I'm doing with this channel. Lots more to come. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.
Back in October, I became a bit obsessed with ferrofluid, and I This video has been sponsored by Opera. Back in 2019, I was sent some old jewelry from a viewer, and this video has been sponsored by Opera. Back in 2019, I was sent some old jewelry from a viewer, and I was able to turn it into these pure 24-karat gold bars, which I thought were pretty nice. Since then, though, I've been really interested in gold in general, and a couple years ago, I stumbled onto a form of it that I'd somehow never heard of before. It was something called purple gold, and this website was selling it as jewelry, and in my opinion, it was one of the nicest forms of gold that I had ever seen. However, the color of it also kind of seemed unnatural, and at first, I honestly thought that it was probably a scam. With very little research though, I quickly found out that purple gold was actually real, and according to Wikipedia, it was an alloy of gold and aluminum. Now, I'm not someone who's normally into jewelry, but for some reason, the moment that I saw that it was real, I really wanted to buy some. More specifically though, I really wanted a ring that was made entirely out of purple gold. However, long story short, that website didn't sell one, and as far as I could tell, there wasn't a single company or person in the world who sold a pure purple gold ring. At first, I thought this was kind of odd, but apparently this was just because purple gold was a huge pain to make and to work with in general. It also turned out that Li Hua, the owner of that website, was one of the only companies that even made purple gold jewelry. With all that being said though, I still really wanted a pure purple gold ring, and now, knowing that it was actually impossible to buy, I kind of wanted it even more. At the same time, I also felt that it had to be possible to make an entire ring out of it, and I started thinking that this was something that I might just be able to make myself. I mean, I had absolutely zero experience with purple gold, and I had never made a ring out of anything before, but for some reason, I really felt that I could do it, and I decided to just go for it. But anyway, to get started, the first thing that I had to do was figure out how to even make the purple gold, and with a quick Google search, I was able to find a lot of videos and articles talking about it. However, none of them gave any real information on how to make anything remotely decent. With a bit more searching though, I was eventually able to find this patent, which turned out to be extremely useful. This is because it not only gave a lot of good info about purple gold in general, it also explained how to potentially fix one of the biggest problems with it, which was how fragile it was. It said that normally, with the typical mixture of about 78.5% gold and 21.5% aluminum, it was as brittle as glass or porcelain, and that it was way too fragile to make any jewelry with it. However, it claimed that by altering its composition just slightly, or by adding some other metals to it, like palladium or nickel, it was possible to make purple gold that was significantly stronger. It also provided a bunch of example recipes, and the one that caught my eye was this one, which appeared to be the simplest. It didn't require any other metals besides gold and aluminum, and the only difference was that the gold content was slightly increased to 81%, which would make it about 19 karat gold, and this was what I decided to go with. The only tricky part was that besides the ingredients, it really didn't tell me anything else, and there was pretty much no information on how to actually make the purple gold. So unfortunately, this meant that I was going to have to figure out everything myself, and considering that it was supposed to be really hard to work with, I was honestly kind of worried. What made me feel slightly better though was that at the last second, I found out that all of the purple gold that's sold by Li Hua is actually based on this patent. So even though it didn't give any real instructions, I at least knew that the recipe itself should have been trustworthy, and I decided to just go for it. With that being said, I could now actually get started, and the first and most important thing that I needed was some gold, which unfortunately isn't exactly cheap. So I initially planned on buying as little as possible, and I figured that something like 20 grams would probably be more than enough. At the last minute though, I convinced myself that it was a good idea to get a bit more, just in case I needed it, and long story short, I ended up with this 100-gram bar. In total, this cost me about $5,700 US, or about $7,800 Canadian, and this immediately put me over the budget that I originally had for this project, and it was probably way more than I needed, but oh well. Either way, I now had this beautiful and shiny bar of gold, and just looking at it and holding it in my hand was oddly satisfying. The only sad part was that it was kind of useless to me as one big bar, and unfortunately, the first thing that I had to do with it was destroy it. More specifically, I was going to have to break it apart into a bunch of smaller pieces because I had to be able to measure out very specific and accurate amounts of it. To do this, the most obvious way would have been to tear it apart manually using something like a chisel and a hammer, but that would have been an insane amount of work, with most likely mediocre results. Instead, I felt that it was a much better idea to do it chemically, so I just carefully placed it in a beaker, and I poured in a bunch of concentrated hydrochloric acid. I then turned on the heating, and over the next few minutes, it slowly warmed up, and it eventually started boiling. Then, when I felt that I was ready, I shot in some concentrated nitric acid. Almost immediately, there was a lot more bubbling, and the solution started changing color. This is because the nitric acid was reacting with the hydrochloric acid, and it was forming nitrosyl chloride and chlorine gas, both of which are yellow. More importantly though, unlike the hydrochloric acid alone, this new acid mixture, commonly known as aqua regia, was able to attack the gold bar. It wasn't super fast, but it was slowly shredding it apart, and it was turning it into something called chloroauric acid, which was then getting dissolved away. So, what I was doing here was basically breaking it apart at the atomic level, which was way better than I could ever do manually, and on top of that, it was just a lot easier. All I had to do was occasionally add small amounts of nitric acid, and over the next few hours, it very slowly disappeared. Eventually, all that was left was just a thin sheet of gold, and with just a little bit more acid, I was able to completely get rid of it. There was now absolutely no trace of the original bar, and all 100 grams of the gold was dissolved as the chloroauric acid. I then let it cool down to room temperature, and what I had to do next was turn all of this chloroauric acid back into metallic gold. At first, it might not make much sense why I just dissolved it all, only to immediately bring it back, but it'll all make sense in a few minutes. With that being said, I then just grabbed the beaker and started walking over to my other fume hood.
Oh no.
Okay, that was actually just a beaker full of water and food coloring, and what I really did was pour it all into a bunch of extra water. I also washed the beaker a few times with some more water to make sure that there was absolutely no gold left behind. Then after that, I stirred it around to make sure that it was all fully mixed, and when I felt that I was ready, I dumped in a concentrated solution of potassium metabisulfite. This caused the entire thing to quickly turn brown and to heat up a lot, and I was really happy to see this. This is because it meant that the potassium metabisulfite was working and that it was reducing all of the gold in the chloroauric acid back to its metallic form. The very important part, though, was that it wasn't all just coming back as a large chunk or something, and it was instead crashing out as a superfine powder. So, by just dissolving the bar and bringing it back, I had effectively pulverized it to a dust, and again, this was way better and easier than anything I ever could have done manually. Over the next 30 minutes, pretty much all of it sank to the bottom, but there was still a small amount of it floating around. So, I decided to leave it overnight, and when I came back to it the next day, it was completely clear. I was now able to get rid of all the water, and I just quickly poured it out into another container. I was also very careful to not lose any of the gold, and when it eventually looked like there was almost no water left, I transferred it all to a small beaker. I then poured in some boiling distilled water, and I turned on the hot plate, and I let it sit there for several minutes. I was doing this to get rid of any residual potassium metabisulfite and other side products, and after that, I did it a few times with hot hydrochloric acid. This would help get rid of any trace impurities of other metals that might be there, and when I felt that it looked good, I washed it a few more times with hot water. What I had now should have been some super nice and clean gold, and all I had to do next was dry it, so I cranked up the heating on the hot plate, and I waited for all the water to disappear. This ended up taking over an hour, which was way longer than I expected, but when it was eventually done, I had some nice and crispy powdered gold. When I weighed it, it was also 99.99 grams, and this meant that I had only lost 0.01 grams in this entire process. However, considering that the original bar was only 99.99% pure, it was very possible that this small amount was actually just some impurity, and that what I had now was more pure than it was before. But anyway, at this point, all of the gold was ready to go, and the only other thing that I needed was some aluminum, and I bought this bag of it from eBay. It was supposed to be 99.995% pure, and it was the absolute highest purity that I was able to find. It also came as a bunch of small pellets, which I felt would make it easy to measure out, and now it was finally time to try and make some purple gold. So I carefully measured out 4.95 grams of the gold, which was really easy to do in its powder form, and I added it to a small crucible. Normally, I also would have added something called borax, which would both help the gold melt and prevent it from sticking to the dish, but I unfortunately couldn't do that here because it would react with the aluminum. Either way, I then just started blasting it with a blowtorch, and very quickly the top of it turned red hot, and I could slowly see some of it starting to melt. As I kept heating it, it was also slowly shrinking, and about 30 seconds later, I was left with two separate blobs, which eventually combined to form a nice little bead. I then kept blasting it just to get it as hot as possible, and when it was red hot, I dumped in exactly 1.61 grams of the aluminum metal. The ones that were touching the gold almost immediately melted and combined with it, but it looked like the others needed a bit more convincing. However, even after making them red hot, they still weren't melting, and this was because the thin oxide layer that naturally forms around aluminum was holding in the liquid metal. So to actually get it to mix, I was gonna have to poke at it a bit, and I was happy to see that it all easily combined together. What I was more happy to see, though, was that below all of the crusty oxides on the top, it looked like there was a nice and free-flowing liquid. I was also kind of surprised to see this, because there were at least a few comments that I read online which said that doing this in the presence of air would turn the entire thing into a horrible oxidized mess. However, it wasn't nearly as reactive as I initially thought, and it definitely seemed like it could be possible to pour this into a mold or something. With that being said, I now theoretically had a mixture of 81% gold and 19% aluminum, except it wasn't even remotely purple, and this was because it was still way too hot. It was also still a liquid, and to get it to turn purple, I was gonna have to let it cool down. As this happened, it was supposed to slowly crystallize as an alloy, where most of it had the chemical formula AuAl2, which is the form that has a really nice purple color. According to the patent, though, by skewing the gold content slightly higher than the typical 78.5%, it would push a bunch of it towards a gamma phase gold aluminum structure. I honestly still don't entirely know what that means, and I've had a very hard time finding any good info about it, but the important part was that it was supposed to make the alloy a lot stronger. When it did eventually get to room temperature, though, it sadly still wasn't purple, because it was covered in a bunch of blue oxidized junk. If there were actually any purple gold, it was all hidden inside, and to see if it were there, I was first gonna have to get it out of the crucible. So I just carefully poked at it with a metal spatula, and even without any borax, it was surprisingly easy to remove. What I had now was a super crusty and ugly piece of metal, and to see if I had actually made any purple gold, all I had to do was break it open. I also figured that this would be pretty easy considering how weak and brittle even this stronger stuff was supposed to be, so I just tried snapping it in half. However, it turned out to be a lot tougher than I expected, and it really didn't feel like I was even close to breaking it. So instead, I decided to just quickly kill it with a hammer, and I kind of assumed that it would easily shatter. But again, that apparently wasn't the case. I mean, I didn't exactly hit it super hard, but still, it definitely didn't seem like it was as brittle as glass or porcelain, and all of that gamma phase stuff appeared to be working. But anyway, I then just kept hitting it, each time doing it a bit harder, and when it did eventually break, I was really happy with what I saw. Inside of it was a bunch of beautiful purple gold, and the color of it almost seemed unnatural. What I thought was kind of odd, though, was that it wasn't quite the purple that I was expecting, and it seemed like it was a lot pinker than the jewelry I'd seen online. This made me think that maybe I'd chosen a bad recipe or something, but when I checked the patent, it actually said that it was supposed to be a pinkish purple. It also said the same thing for all of the other recipes, and again, considering that this was the patent that the Liwa stuff was based on, I trusted that it was probably good. I also started thinking that maybe the darker color only came out later on in the process or when it was being polished or something, and I decided to just keep going. So now, assuming that this recipe was good, what I had to do next was somehow figure out how to go from just making a bunch of crusty crap to a nice and shiny ring. This was going to be a lot of work though, and just thinking about all of the different things that I was going to have to test kind of overwhelmed me, and this made me feel that the only way to move forward was to just take the process step by step. This way, I wouldn't break my brain and I would only have to focus on one major problem at a time, and right now, I felt that the biggest issue was the oxides. This is because they were clearly making everything a huge mess, and if I even wanted a remote chance of making anything nice, I was definitely going to have to get rid of them. To do this, there was also only one real way, and I was going to have to somehow stop the aluminum from reacting with oxygen in the air. So I went online looking for some ideas, and after searching for a long time, I was only able to find two decent suggestions. The first was to buy a super expensive and specialized inert atmosphere casting machine, and the second one was to basically custom build something that was equivalent. However, I really didn't feel like it had to be that complicated or expensive, and after thinking about it for a while, I came up with an idea that I thought was relatively simple. I figured that all I had to do was use this small tabletop furnace that I already owned, and to load in one of my smallest crucibles. Then after that, I just lowered in some stainless steel tubing that I'd gotten for free, and I'd quickly bent it to fit around the furnace. What was important though was that at the other end of this tubing, it was connected to a tank filled with inert argon gas that I'd gotten from a local welding shop, and that was basically it. What I had now was just a regular furnace with the ability to shoot some argon into it, and I really felt that it was going to work. There was only one way to find out though, so I quickly added the gold, started a steady flow of argon, and I set the furnace to 2200 Fahrenheit, which is about 1100 Celsius. Over the next 15 minutes, it then slowly heated up, and the gold powder slowly shrank, except it was looking like it was having some trouble melting with the top open, so I covered it with some KO wool. After that, it only took a few minutes to have a nice little blob of gold at the bottom, and now I could add the aluminum. This time though, I decided to use some much larger pieces of it, which weren't quite as pure, but I was hoping that they would liquefy a lot more easily than the smaller ones. To load it in, I just carefully dropped in the first piece, and I was very happy to see that it all quickly combined with the gold. I then added the rest of the aluminum, which also quickly got sucked up, and at this point, it was already looking way better than the first attempt. What I was especially excited about was that it looked like there were barely any oxides, and this meant that the argon was doing a decent job. This was also really impressive considering that the aluminum was red hot, and that it was way more reactive than normal liquid aluminum. But anyway, what I had now was some nice and relatively oxide-free purple gold, and what I had to do next was try and pour it. In theory, it probably would have been a good idea to protect it from air while I did that as well, and I did consider putting together some sort of specialized setup. However, instead, I decided to go with the very sophisticated method of just going as fast as possible. So I just quickly got rid of the argon line, pulled the crucible out of the furnace, and tried pouring it out onto a preheated graphite mold. As I did this, I was really hoping to see a nice stream of red-hot metal, but nothing was coming out, and it didn't even work when I tilted it completely upside down. At first, I was kind of confused, but then I realized that all of the purple gold had just frozen in the crucible. Apparently, just a few seconds was enough for it to cool down below its melting point, and I was clearly going to have to get it as hot as possible. So I just put it back in the furnace, dropped in the argon line, and covered the top, and I left it there until the entire thing was bright red. I then again attempted to go as fast as possible, and it was still a bit stubborn, but I was actually able to pour it out. The only sad part was that it was a complete piece of trash, and having to remelt it had apparently caused it to get really oxidized. This told me that I only had one real chance to pour it out, which wasn't ideal, but at least now, I knew exactly what to do. So I quickly whipped up a new batch of the purple gold, and this time when I poured it out, I was really happy with what I saw. I then let it cool down to room temperature, and when I took a closer look at it, it was definitely the best result that I had so far. I mean, it still wasn't perfect, but it looked way cleaner, and it wasn't anything like the crusty mess that I had before. The only thing that I thought was odd was that it was silver, and I had assumed that without a lot of the oxides, that it would have been significantly more purple. At the same time though, I figured that maybe it was just a bit of aluminum or something that was on the surface, and that it would be really easy to get rid of. So I decided to try sanding it a bit, and I was assuming that when I flipped it over, I would see that really nice pinkish purple color, except it was still just silver. I then tried sanding it even more, thinking that maybe I just hadn't taken enough away, but it didn't seem to make a difference. When I saw this, I was honestly kind of confused, and the only explanation that I could think of was that I had somehow failed to make the purple gold. So to check this, I was going to have to break it open, and this time, I was even more surprised by how strong it was. I was hitting it way harder than before, and it didn't seem to do anything, and eventually, it ended up making a huge dent in my wooden table. After hitting it 7 times though, I was finally able to crack a small piece off of it, and I was kind of upset by what I saw. This is because inside of it, it was definitely colored, and it made no sense why sanding it wasn't working. What I thought was even more upsetting though, was that it was only barely pink, and it wasn't nearly as vibrant as the first attempt. This also really didn't make any sense to me, because I'd basically done the exact same thing as before, except without any air present, and it really shouldn't have had any effect on the color. However, I was going to have to be absolutely sure that this wasn't an issue with the new setup, or with the different aluminum, and to test this, I just quickly did the exact same thing, and I made a fresh piece of it, and I waited for it to cool down. I then got my hammer, and this time I protected my table with a steel plate, and after one good hit, I was really happy with what I saw. It was actually purple, which told me that my setup and my aluminum were probably fine, and I still have no idea what went wrong with the first one. Either way, I then took one of these pieces, and I assumed that with the much stronger color, it would actually sand properly, but that apparently wasn't the case. Like before, no matter how much I sanded it, it never turned purple, and I just couldn't understand why. What was even worse though, was that after this, I tried just sanding the purple part itself, mostly out of desperation, and I was devastated when I saw that it turned silver. I had no idea how this was even possible, but it was a horrible thing to see, because if sanding it or grinding it wasn't an option, it would be extremely hard to make anything nice out of it. As a completely last-ditch effort to fix this problem, I decided to drop this little piece of it into a beaker and to add some hydrochloric acid. I thought that maybe just a very thin layer of aluminum was blocking the purple gold or something, and I was hoping that the acid would get rid of it. However, as the aluminum disappeared, it just slowly went back to being pure gold, which I actually thought was pretty interesting, but it didn't help me at all. At this point, I was really lost as to why this was happening, and I had almost no idea how to fix it, and I ended up spending the next few days trying a bunch of other random stuff. I then spent another few days reading everything that I could find online, and after finding absolutely nothing useful, I honestly kind of felt like giving up. Before doing that though, I decided to look at the patent one last time, and this turned out to be a really good idea because I saw something that I'd somehow never noticed before. It was also almost just said in passing, but it was here where it was mentioning the purple color, and the key words were, "at least on annealing, at 600 C." This didn't directly address the problem that I was having, but it implied that there was a way to enhance or recover the color, and I figured that this was my only chance. So I just quickly preheated an unused crucible to 600 C, and for this attempt, I also made this fresh new piece that I had sanded down nice and flat. Just like all the other times, this made it completely silver, and it kind of just looked like a generic piece of metal, and I had a hard time believing that this could actually turn purple. There was only one way to find out though, so I dropped it into the crucible, and then based on absolutely nothing, I decided to leave it for about 30 minutes. When I came back to it, I was honestly feeling pretty hopeful, and I was really curious to see how it was doing. So to get a closer look at it, I just carefully pulled out the crucible and I dumped it onto some insulation, and I was genuinely shocked by what I saw. Almost like magic, it had actually somehow turned purple, and the moment that I saw this, I was really relieved. This is because it was very obvious that the heat treatment had worked, and the project was thankfully no longer at a complete dead end. What I thought was really interesting though, was that as it continued cooling down, the color of it slowly changed, and it was gradually shifting more towards that pinkish purple. However, it didn't seem to get quite as pink as I saw with the first attempt, and when I took a closer look at it, it appeared to be a darker purple. I mean, it still definitely wasn't as purple as the stuff that I saw online, but this at least showed me that even with the same recipe, the color could actually be pretty different. This also made me think that maybe by annealing it for longer, or just in a different way, it might have been possible to make it even more purple. With all that being said though, right now what I had was still kind of a piece of crap, and I felt that the most important thing to do next was to see if it was even possible to make something nice. More specifically, I had to see if I could actually mold it into a specific shape and then clean it up, and I was really tempted to just immediately try and make a ring. However, I knew that starting with something complicated like a ring would be a horrible idea, and it would introduce a whole bunch of new issues, so instead, I decided to just make a simple little bar. In particular though, I really wanted to make one that looked exactly like a typical gold bar, except that it was purple, and I went ahead and melted a bunch more metal. After that, I went and got one of my small bar molds, and this time, I was gonna blast it until it was red hot. I was really hoping that this would prevent the metal from freezing and help it fill the mold better, and when I felt that I was ready, I carefully poured it in. I was a bit concerned that I was gonna miss or something, but it all turned out fine, and I was really happy to see that it easily filled the entire mold. I then let it all slowly cool down, and when it was eventually around room temperature, I had to get it out of the mold, and I was a bit worried that it might be stuck. However, that clearly wasn't the case, and it just easily fell out, and this made it pretty clear to me that there was no issue with molding it. There was of course still one problem though, and that was how ugly it was, and what I had to do next was see if I could actually turn it into something nice. To do this, I decided to just sand it by hand, which wasn't exactly ideal, but I didn't want to lose any of the precious gold dust. Unsurprisingly though, this turned out to be super tedious and difficult, and it ended up taking 10 hours to get it into a shape that I liked. I then polished it by moving up to finer and finer sandpapers, and when I eventually felt that it looked good, I annealed it, and this was the final result. It was pretty much exactly what I was hoping for, and it was just like a normal gold bar, except it was pinkish purple, and I was really happy with how it turned out. The only thing that I thought was odd was that it didn't seem nearly as purple as my other piece, and this one kind of looked like it was a light pink. However, after a bunch of testing, I found that this was mostly just because it was way shinier, which made it appear a lot brighter, and I'll talk more about this later on. With all that being said though, being able to make this fully proved to me that it was definitely possible to cast and clean up the purple gold, and at this point, I was feeling pretty excited. However, my mood completely changed when I decided to take a much closer look at it, and I was kind of horrified by what I saw. It was apparently riddled with a bunch of small cracks, and I have no idea how I didn't see this at all up until now, and I think I was just blinded by all of the excitement. What made things even worse was that it also looked like the color wasn't very uniform, and there were a lot of spots that appeared to be completely colorless, almost like the metals didn't mix properly. In my opinion, though, that would be a relatively easy fix, and I just had to mix things better, and the much bigger problem was all of the cracks. This is especially because once I noticed them, I couldn't just unsee them, and I couldn't help but think that they were super ugly. What made it even more horrible was that it was throughout the entire thing, which meant that I couldn't just sand it away, and when I looked back at some other random pieces that I made, I noticed that it was there too. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe that was just how purple gold was, and to prove this, I ended up buying a small pendant from Li Hua. The moment that I opened the box, though, I immediately realized that I was just in denial. This because the surface of it looked almost perfect, and I wasn't able to see any of those gross cracks in it. It was only when I really zoomed in that I could actually see some small surface defects, and there were definitely at least a few small holes. I could also vaguely see that, like mine, the color wasn't perfectly uniform either, but overall, it was clearly way better than what I made. As a quick side note, it also seemed to be significantly more purple than my pinkish bar, but again, this turned out to be mostly just a lighting thing, and I promise that I'll talk about this more later on. But anyway, at this point, it was pretty obvious that these holes weren't meant to be there, and the very unfortunate part was that I still had no idea what I was doing wrong. All I knew was that I hated how ugly it was, and that this was unfortunately something else that I was going to have to fix, and this project really just felt like a never-ending sequence of problems. With that being said, just like before, I ended up trying a bunch of random things, and when they all inevitably failed, I desperately looked at the patent, and I tried searching online. However, unlike last time, I wasn't able to find even a vague reference of this happening with purple gold. What I did find, though, were a lot of sources that mentioned a very similar problem that commonly happened with pure aluminum. I also found a really useful report that talked about this issue in detail, and they provided a photo of what it could make the aluminum look like. All of the dark spots were small holes, just like what I was seeing with the purple gold, and apparently, this was mostly just caused by moisture in the air. This is because when aluminum is molten, it's able to react with the moisture, which then causes it to form some of those crusty oxides like we saw before, as well as some hydrogen gas. I always kind of assumed that all of this hydrogen then kind of just floated away, but apparently, a lot of it actually gets dissolved into the molten aluminum. Then, as the aluminum cools, the solubility of the hydrogen slowly decreases, and right around the time that the aluminum is solidifying, it all gets kicked out as a bunch of bubbles. What I thought was interesting, though, was that they also provided this photo, which is what it looks like if all of the hydrogen's removed before it solidifies. There's a pretty obvious difference, and all of those cavities are completely gone, and now, it's just a nice and smooth piece of aluminum. After seeing this, I felt that it was pretty clear that this was almost the exact same issue that I was having, and this seemed to be confirmed when I looked back at some of my footage. More specifically, I looked back to when the bar was solidifying, and I was able to see what looked like bubbles popping on the surface. When I saw this, I felt that it was pretty clear that this was all just hydrogen gas getting kicked out as it solidified. The only thing that I thought was weird was that I was already using argon to block out all of the air, and therefore the moisture, and I wasn't entirely sure where this hydrogen was coming from. I mean, it was possible that it was from the short period of time that it sat there in open air before solidifying, but I really didn't feel like that was the case. Either way though, if I wanted to make something that wasn't hideous, I was going to have to somehow get all of the hydrogen out of the aluminum, and there were apparently many different ways to do this. So I decided to just try everything that I thought might work, and one method that I thought was really promising was to just include a bunch of table salt. However, again, most of the things that I tried totally failed, and after a week of frustration, I felt that I was left with only one real option. For this one, I was going to have to try and bubble some argon gas through the molten purple gold, instead of just using it to protect it from air. This was actually something that I'd been kind of avoiding, because even though it sounded relatively simple, it was kind of tricky, and I wasn't going to be able to just lower in my stainless steel tubing. This is because at 1200 C, the aluminum was way too angry, and it would just dissolve it, and I saw this happen firsthand when it dissolved one of my steel spatulas. So I was gonna have to swap out my tubing for one with a different material, and unfortunately, there weren't many other options. I couldn't just use other metals because they would also probably get dissolved, I couldn't use glass because it would melt, and I couldn't use graphite because, as far as I can tell, small graphite tubes don't exist. After thinking about it for a while though, I started wondering if something like fused quartz might work, and I remembered that I actually had a bunch of small tubes that I'd gotten for free. Just by looking at them, they appeared to be pretty much the same as normal glass, except unlike normal glass, they were made with nearly 100% silicon dioxide. This would make them significantly more resistant to high temperatures, and there should be almost no risk of it melting or cracking, and I really didn't see why it wouldn't work. I also had a lot of faith in fused quartz after I'd used some to burn diamonds, and it had survived being red hot under a flow of pure oxygen. So I decided to give it a chance, and I was really excited to get started, but then I realized that I actually had no gold left. This is because in all of my random attempts, I had apparently used all 99.99 grams of it, and it was now just a bunch of random trash. This was kind of a huge pain, but I didn't really have a choice, and I just quickly redissolved it all in a bunch of acid, and I processed it in the same way as the original gold bar. Then after a couple days of work, I had some nice and crispy gold powder, except when I weighed it, it was only 95 grams. This meant that I'd somehow lost about 5 grams of gold along the way, and this made no sense to me because I'd been extremely careful, and I thought that I'd collected absolutely everything. Either way, I could now finally test out my new method, so I went back to my furnace, and I poured in all 95 grams of the gold that I had just purified. This is because I didn't think that it could be done on a very small scale, and if I wanted to actually be able to bubble gas through it, I felt that I was going to need as much molten metal as possible. With all of the gold melted, I then carefully lowered in the quartz tube, and with it in place, I slowly opened the argon. Then on top of this, I dumped in the aluminum, which all quickly melted, and this time, I stirred it with a graphite rod. This was also what I should have been using from the beginning, because unlike my spatula, it wouldn't just dissolve, and when I eventually felt that it looked good, I lowered in the quartz tube, and I slowly increased the gas flow. My goal was to get it to bubble as much as possible without splashing too much, and the idea here was that the argon would carry the hydrogen out of the metal. To a certain degree, this would also help mix the gold and aluminum, and when I felt that it was going at a steady rate, I covered it with some insulation. I then had to leave it like this for a while to make sure that I got out as much of the hydrogen as possible, and based on what I read online, about 20 minutes seemed decent. So I basically just had to wait, and in the meantime, I went and got my mold, which was again, just a simple bar mold. This is because I had to make something that I could compare to the last one, and to see if this process had actually made a difference. But anyway, at this point, it had been about 20 minutes, so I started blasting the mold with the torch. Then, when I eventually felt that it looked nice and hot, I quickly took apart the whole degassing setup, and going as fast as I could, I poured it all into the mold. After that, I waited for it to cool down, and when it got to around room temperature, I popped it out of the mold, and I started cleaning it up. Almost immediately, It was already pretty clear that there was a major improvement, and even after very little sanding, it looked like most of the cracks were gone. I would only really be able to know for sure once it was all nice and shiny though, so I just kept on going, and many horribly painful hours later, I annealed it, and this was what I eventually had. Without even comparing it to the other bar, this one was clearly way better, and what I was extremely happy to see was that it didn't seem to be riddled with a bunch of small holes. To actually know how much better it was though, I was gonna have to pull up a photo of the old one, and the moment that I saw it, the difference genuinely surprised me. It was actually somehow even uglier than I remembered, and it was pretty undeniable that the degassing step had made a significant difference. I mean, if I really zoomed in, I could clearly see some very small holes, and it definitely wasn't perfect, but overall, I still thought that it was really nice, and I was very happy with how it turned out. The only thing that was still kind of off was the color, and just like the other bar, it was definitely more on the pink side. However, as I mentioned a couple times earlier, it turned out that this was all just an annoying lighting issue. This was actually something that really messed with my head for a while, and it's honestly sad how long I spent staring at little pieces of metal and trying to compare their colors. What really settled things for me though was getting that pendant from Li Hua, which allowed me to compare my stuff to some professionally produced purple gold. I also started using a polarizer for my camera, which would let me remove some of the reflections, and suddenly, it was very clear that they were the same color. To me, this really showed that it was all just lighting, and I think that my bar is just a lot shinier or something, which makes it generally appear brighter. Color aside though, at this point, I finally had what I felt was a decent way to make the purple gold, and after months of going in circles, this was a huge relief. However, I of course wasn't quite done yet, and the last thing that I still had to do was make my ring, which was the entire reason why I started this project. The only concerning part was that I still wasn't entirely sure how to do this, and I was kind of worried that I'd end up in another horrible pit of trial and error. To try and avoid this though, I decided to go with the simplest method that I could think of, and the first thing that I did was buy a ring sizer from Amazon. I then tested a bunch of them to see which one fit my finger the best, and this was extremely important. This is because, as we saw before, the purple gold was completely non-malleable, and this meant that any cast that I made had to be almost perfectly pre-sized. With that being said, when I eventually found one that I thought fit, I was able to make a super basic 3D design, and now I just had to turn this into a mold. With normal gold, there are a few common ways to do this, like with lost PLA casting, but I was worried that all of them would end up having issues with the purple gold. So instead, I decided the best idea was to just do it in a graphite mold, which I was now very familiar with, and I knew would probably work. The only tricky part was that I couldn't just buy a mold, and for it to perfectly fit my finger, it was gonna have to be custom made. In theory, I probably could have found someone online to do this for me, but instead I used this as an excuse to buy a CNC machine and to learn how to carve out my own graphite molds. This actually ended up being a lot of fun, even though it was sometimes a bit frustrating, and I can now make pretty much any graphite mold that I want. With that being said, for this project, all I had to do was make this super simple one, and with it now ready, I was finally able to try and make the ring. So again, I just quickly repurified all of the gold that wasn't used to make my big bar, and I remelted half of it in the furnace. I did this so I'd be able to get at least 2 attempts, and I was just hoping that 30 grams of gold and about 7 grams of aluminum would give enough volume for the degassing. I then let it sit there, and after about 15 minutes, I started blasting the mold with a torch, and I was eventually ready to try and pour it. I was honestly really concerned that I would either completely miss or that the metal wouldn't flow through the entire thing, but it turned out to be totally fine. All I had to do now was wait for it to cool down, except this part I was actually more concerned about because I knew that this was going to cause it to shrink. This was also a huge issue because this meant that the inner side of the ring would start contracting while the outer side of it would stretch, and since the purple gold had no real malleability or ductility, this would almost definitely cause it to break. To try and avoid this, I'd purposely angled the inner edges of the mold, hoping that as it contracted, it might pop itself out without cracking. At the same time, I genuinely believed that there was a narrow window of time where it was possible to manually remove it, and I just kept trying to pry it out. However, I apparently wasn't skilled enough, and it ended up just cracking itself in half. It just snapped. This was also really sad because the ring had actually molded super well, and now, unless I want to spend days repurifying everything again, I only had one last chance. So I just anxiously whipped together another batch, heated the mold red hot, and carefully poured everything in. This time though, there somehow wasn't enough metal to fill the entire mold, and at first I was sad about this, but it actually turned out to be a good thing. This is because it prevented the ring from fully connecting, so as it contracted, it didn't just squeeze down on the middle part and snap itself, and I was actually able to get it out of the mold. Huh. What I had now wasn't exactly what I was expecting, and it kind of looked like a failed attempt, but at the same time, I felt that this different shape was kind of cool, and I decided to just go with it. I then spent the next couple of days sanding and grinding it, and this time I also used a Dremel, which made things a lot easier. The part that I actually had the most trouble with was just coming up with a design that I liked, and almost the entire time, I was really worried that it would turn out absolutely hideous. Eventually though, I was able to make something that I felt I was happy with, so I polished it up as best I could and then annealed it, and this was the final result. It was honestly way nicer than I ever imagined it would be, and I kind of found it hard to believe that I had actually done it. I finally had my ring that was made entirely out of purple gold, and it was probably one of the only ones in existence, and after months of work, I think it was all worth it. What was also nice was that it wasn't nearly as fragile as I thought it would be, and even though I'm not going to test it, I don't think it would break if I dropped it. I also don't think that it would be a problem to casually wear it, as long as I'm careful, and I would probably just have to avoid accidentally slamming it into things. With all that being said though, when I first started this project, I was honestly really concerned that it would just be a total failure, especially because of all of the things that I had read online. However, it turned out that purple gold wasn't nearly as bad to work with as I thought, and with just a relatively simple setup, I definitely think that it's possible to make some nice jewelry. I also think that there's still a lot of room for improvement on the method that I used, and I already have a few ideas that I want to test out. For example, something that I really want to try is just using higher purity argon, which has less moisture in it, and I want to try swapping my quartz tubes for something like alumina. I'm also kind of tempted to completely switch to a different degassing method like ultrasonic, and most importantly, I think there are definitely some better ways to cast and mold it. For now though, I think I'm kind of tired of melting, casting, and grinding purple gold, and instead I'm going to work on some more tasty projects, like turning air into alcohol. Okay, so in the end, this was probably the most tedious and frustrating project that I ever worked on, and what made it even worse was that I somehow kept on losing gold. I honestly still have no idea where it went, because I was really careful with everything, and I'm kind of convinced that it just got evaporated or something with the aluminum. Either way though, I'm really happy that it's all finally done, and I want to give a big thanks to my patrons for making projects like this possible, and to Opera for sponsoring this video. I've been using Opera on desktop for a while now, and in my opinion, it's still the best browser that I've ever used. Not only is it really fast and intuitive and loaded with a bunch of extra features, it also just got an update to its lucid mode, which I think is pretty cool. This is because with just a click of a button, it's possible to immediately enhance any video, and now with this update, it's also possible to manually adjust the sharpness, and there's also a button to easily see a before and after. Besides lucid mode though, another feature that I like is this sidebar, which I think is really useful. This is because it lets me easily access all of the social media that I often use, like Messenger, WhatsApp, Instagram, and TikTok, and it even has an integrated music app where I can listen to things like Spotify and Apple Music. On top of all of this, they even have a built-in VPN service and an ad blocker, as well as some integrated AI tools. In particular, they have Aria, which is Opera's native and completely free AI service, and it's similar to ChatGPT, except with even more features. It's also totally optional whether or not you want to use Aria, and it would only be activated if you choose to opt in. Besides all of these tools though, what I also really like is their Tab Island feature, which really helps me get all of my tabs under control, and this is especially useful when I'm doing research for a project. With that being said though, I've been having a really nice time just using Opera in general, and I still think that it's worth giving it a try for just the sidebar alone. It's also, of course, completely free to use, and you can download it right now by clicking the link in the description. That's it. As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see all my new videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. You'll also get access to all the older videos that I had to take down, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your name at the end like you see here.